In the beginning, people would say he's arrogant, but I don't think so.
Paul Simon, the musical genius behind Simon and Garfunkel, has spent more than 6 decades redefining American songwriting. His poetic lyrics, sharp wit, and unparalleled musicianship made him one of the greatest singer-songwriters in history. But behind that calm, reflective persona lies a man with strong opinions, especially about the music industry and his peers. Known for his perfectionism and fiery artistic standards, Simon never shied away from calling out what he didn't like, whether it was about sound, lyrics, or authenticity. "Music should mean something," he once said. "If it doesn't, it's just noise." Over the years, he's made biting comments about several famous bands, some of whom were shocked to learn how little he respected their work. While fans remember Simon as the soft-spoken poet of The Sound of Silence, insiders knew a different man, one who could be brutally honest behind closed doors. Whether it was bands he found overrated, artists he thought lacked depth, or groups that clashed with his personal philosophy of music, Simon's opinions were often raw and unfiltered. This is the untold side of Paul Simon, the man who built bridges with his lyrics but burned a few in real life. From rock legends to pop icons, these are the 6 bands Paul Simon couldn't stand. And the real stories behind the grudges, rivalries, and artistic clashes that defined an era. Because when it came to music, Paul Simon didn't just sing from the heart. He judged from it, too. It's hard to imagine Paul Simon, the introspective folk poet of Simon and Garfunkel, publicly criticizing the Beatles. After all, they were contemporaries, each reshaping the sound of the 1960s. But Simon's admiration for them had limits, and it didn't take long for frustration to set in. In interviews over the years, Simon admitted that while the Beatles were undeniably talented, their massive popularity and media-fueled hype made them almost impossible for him to respect fully. "They were brilliant, don't get me wrong," he once said, adjusting his signature glasses. "But the world built them into gods, and that made it hard to see the humans behind the music." Simon's main issue was not technical skill. He recognized Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and Starr as gifted musicians. It was the overwhelming spectacle that surrounded them, screaming fans, endless press, and the almost religious fervor that seemed to elevate their work above all else. "Music is meant to connect, not intimidate," he argued. And sometimes, the Beatles made people feel small just by existing. The tension wasn't personal. Paul Simon and the Beatles rarely crossed paths professionally in a way that would create real conflict. Instead, it was artistic philosophy. Simon valued subtlety, lyrical depth, and storytelling over spectacle, while the Beatles often reveled in experimentation, theatrics, and massive production. To him, some of their later albums, despite their genius, felt overproduced, technically impressive, but emotionally distant. One story Simon shared involved a private listening session in the early 1970s, where a producer played him Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in its entirety. While Simon acknowledged the album's innovation, he walked out saying, "It's like a carnival, brilliant, but I don't feel it. I don't feel the heart." To fans, these comments seemed harsh, but to Simon, they were honest. He wasn't trying to diminish the Beatles' legacy. He simply viewed their work through a lens of personal authenticity. He sought rawness, simplicity, and music that spoke directly to the soul. The massive aura of Beatlemania, to him, was both awe-inspiring and alienating. This subtle disdain didn't stop Simon from appreciating certain tracks. Yesterday, In My Life, Norwegian Wood. But his frustration with the cultural idolization lingered. "They made music history, yes," he admitted, "but I wanted my music to make history quietly, without the fanfare." In the end, Simon's feelings were not about jealousy. They were about principle. The Beatles were a phenomenon, But for Paul Simon, a musician's genius wasn't measured in screaming crowds or chart-topping singles. It was measured in the honesty and vulnerability conveyed in every note and lyric. For Simon, the Beatles were a constant reminder that greatness and authenticity sometimes don't align, a lesson that would shape his approach to evaluating the next band on his list. While the Beatles stirred Paul Simon's critical eye with their overhyped perfection, the Rolling Stones triggered an entirely different reaction, one rooted in their chaos. Known as the bad boys of rock, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and the rest of the band epitomized rebellion, excess, and raw energy. But for Simon, their brand of rock and roll often crossed the line from thrilling to grating. Simon admired musical skill. There was no denying the Stones' talent. But he had a low tolerance for theatrics that overshadowed artistry. Music is meant to touch the heart, not just the ears, he remarked during an interview. To him, the Stones' notorious stage antics and wild lifestyles sometimes diluted the emotional resonance of their songs. They were loud, they were rowdy, and people loved it. But I couldn't always hear the story in their music because of the chaos surrounding it. He found the Stones' image-driven persona frustrating. While Jagger's strut and swagger became iconic, Simon often felt it was more show than substance. In his view, the band was wrapped in an aura of mischief that drew attention away from the craft itself. "I respect what they do, but I don't always respect the way it's done," he admitted. Sometimes it felt like rebellion for rebellion's sake, not art for art's sake. Simon also struggled with the lyrical content. While songs like Angie or Paint It Black carried poetic weight, much of the Stones' catalog glorified hedonism, risk-taking, and decadence, themes Simon found emotionally hollow. He preferred storytelling that revealed human vulnerability rather than bravado and machismo. The Stones' dangerous image, he felt, often overshadowed the genuine musical expression that he valued deeply. Despite his criticisms, Simon acknowledged the Stones' undeniable influence. They pushed boundaries, challenged societal norms, and inspired countless musicians. But Simon remained steadfast in his philosophy. Music should provoke thought and emotion, not just spectacle. When asked if he listened to the Stones regularly, he chuckled. "I do, sometimes for nostalgia, sometimes to remind myself why I write the way I do." Interestingly, Simon's subtle disdain didn't prevent collaboration with musicians influenced by the Stones. He appreciated their historical significance and the energy they brought to the rock scene. But when evaluating music purely on an emotional and lyrical level, the Rolling Stones were consistently near the top of his too wild list. In essence, Simon's criticism stemmed from his unwavering artistic standards. He wanted music to tell a story, to resonate, to endure. For him, the Rolling Stones represented raw power and cultural rebellion, admirable qualities in their own right, but not the kind of musical intimacy he craved. For fans, this perspective might seem surprising. After all, the Stones are legendary. But for Paul Simon, legendary alone wasn't enough. Music had to move the soul, and sometimes the loudest, wildest bands simply couldn't reach him there. By the 1980s, U2 had risen from the streets of Dublin to become one of the biggest rock bands in the world. Their soaring anthems, politically charged lyrics, and stadium-filling performances earned them global acclaim. Yet, for Paul Simon, the Irish giants of rock often bordered on pretentiousness. Simon admired passion, but he was wary of grandiosity. U2's music, with its monumental choruses and overtly ambitious messages, sometimes struck him as more performance than poetry. "There's a difference between moving people and overwhelming them," Simon once explained. U2 often does the latter. The emotion is real, but it's broadcasted like a megaphone instead of whispered to the listener. He understood the appeal. Their music could inspire a crowd of 100,000, unite people for causes, and make stadiums pulse with energy. But Simon's musical philosophy favored intimacy over spectacle. He believed the most powerful songs were those that could touch an individual heart quietly, without the need for grandeur. U2, in his view, often sacrificed nuance for sheer scale. Moreover, Simon was critical of what he saw as the band's moral posturing. While U2 frequently aligned with humanitarian causes and political movements, Simon sometimes felt the messaging overshadowed the music itself. "I respect what they try to do," he said, "but sometimes it's less about the song and more about the statement." Despite these criticisms, Simon acknowledged U2's undeniable talent and influence. The Edge's guitar work, Bono's vocal range, and their commitment to evolving as artists were all impressive. Yet, for Simon, talent alone wasn't enough to guarantee emotional authenticity. It was the subtlety, the understated connection to human experience, that mattered most, something he felt U2 occasionally lost amidst their monumental ambitions. Interestingly, Simon's critiques were never about envy. He wasn't competing with them. He simply had exacting standards. For him, a song's value wasn't measured in chart positions or sold-out arenas, but in its ability to resonate on a deeply personal level. U2's music, though epic, often felt too distant, too expansive to bridge that intimate connection. This perspective also influenced how Simon engaged with the contemporary music scene. He gravitated toward artists who emphasized lyrical depth, emotional honesty, and storytelling. Bands with enormous anthems and sweeping messages fascinated him, but they rarely captured his heart in the way smaller, more introspective acts could. In the end, U2 occupied a peculiar space in Simon's musical universe, respected, admired, but ultimately too ambitious and overproduced to earn his wholehearted appreciation. They were emblematic of the divide between commercial spectacle and personal resonance, a line Paul Simon had spent decades defining in his own music. For fans, it might seem audacious for Simon to criticize one of the world's most celebrated bands, but for him it was about integrity, honesty, and the pursuit of music that could quietly, profoundly touch the soul. After the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and U2, Paul Simon's list of musical frustrations doesn't get any milder. The final three bands he openly admitted to disliking reveal not only his perfectionism, but also his uncompromising vision of what music should be: authentic, subtle, and deeply human. First on this list is Kiss. While their theatrics and makeup were legendary, Simon found their music superficial. "It's hard to respect a band that relies more on costumes than craft," he remarked. Simon wasn't against showmanship. He admired theatricality in theater and film, but Kiss' explosive stage persona often felt like a shield to hide a lack of depth in the music itself. For Simon, the emotional honesty of a simple lyric mattered more than pyrotechnics or an over-the-top performance. Next, the Eagles earned Simon's criticism for what he considered overproduction. Hits like Hotel California and Take It Easy dominated the charts, but Simon often felt they were technically flawless, yet emotionally detached. They were beautiful songs, no doubt, he admitted, but sometimes they sounded too polished, too perfect. Life isn't perfect. Music shouldn't be either. Simon gravitated toward imperfection, the rawness that revealed the human heart, and in the Eagles' music, he sometimes found polish at the expense of authenticity. Finally, Fleetwood Mac drew Simon's ire, not because of lack of talent. He respected Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks immensely, but due to the band's internal drama that seemed to overshadow their artistry. Simon acknowledged the genius in Rumors and Tusk, but he was unsettled by how personal conflicts often became a spectacle for the audience. To him, music was a private communion, not a public soap opera. "I don't mind drama," he said, "but when it becomes the story instead of the music, it loses something essential." Across all six bands, one thing is clear. Simon's criticisms weren't about jealousy or arrogance. They stemmed from a deep, lifelong commitment to musical integrity. He believed that music's power lies in its ability to connect intimately, to tell stories, and to expose vulnerability. When spectacle, perfection, or theatrics overshadowed those elements, Simon became frustrated, even outspoken. Interestingly, many of these bands reportedly took his critiques in stride. Some were amused, some indifferent. Simon didn't intend to publicly attack them. He simply shared his honest perspective, trusting that his own art would speak for itself. And in doing so, he carved out a space in music criticism that few singer-songwriters dare to enter, balancing admiration, honesty, and exacting standards. In reflecting on this list, one realizes that Paul Simon's disdain was never personal. It was philosophical. He was searching for music that mirrored life in all its imperfection, intimacy, and depth. A standard few bands could meet consistently. For Simon, these 6 bands are more than just names on a list. They are a testament to his lifelong pursuit of musical truth. They remind us that even legends can have opinions, even icons can have pet peeves, and that the greatest musicians are often the harshest critics, especially of those who fail to capture the soul behind the sound. And in the end, Paul Simon's honesty serves as a lesson for every music lover. Greatness is measured not only by popularity, but by authenticity, subtlety, and the courage to stay true to your artistic vision, no matter how loud, flashy, or famous the world around you may be.